Greetings to you all, wherever you are on this beautiful planet. My name is Georgie Sabo. I serve as the Dean of Graduate Studies at Ubiquity University and the Wisdom School. I welcome you to this four-part webinar titled Long Journey to a New Story, the Evolution of Civilizations, Cultures, and Consciousness, taught by Dr. Anne Baring. Today, Anne will be covering the whole of the period from 40,000 BC through two terrible cataclysms in 10,000 BC and 9,700 BC. Also covering the Sphinx date, the role of the Egyptian pyramids, and the meaning of the Gobekli Tepe in Turkey. Next week, the topic is the lunar era of the Great Mother, participation in the cosmic soul, and the shamanic vision of kinship with all creation. The third lecture is about the solar patriarchal era, the separation from nature and the battle between good and evil. And the final session will be about the rise of science and technology, the dominance of the old story and awakening to a new story. So why do we need a new story? And why our past matters, you may ask? To answer these questions, we need to observe what kind of past cosmic events and evolutionary processes contributed to the becoming of the human species. Such complex factors influenced throughout the ages how and why humans responded to these challenges call for a coherent interpretation. I believe that Anne Baring profoundly and clearly understands the labyrinth of the human soul, as well as the particular ways its developmental stages created and still creates history, where we are at now globally and where we may be heading collectively. She told me there is no need for me to introduce her to you because you already know who she is, hence you signed up to this lecture series. But at this stage, all I want to say is that on behalf of Ubiquity University and the Wisdom School, let me express my greatest gratitude and appreciation to you, Anne, for sharing your wisdom and knowledge with us and the rest of the world. Now a few words about logistics. After Anne finished her presentation, I will dialogue with her for a short while to make sure that we leave enough time for your questions and comments. If you want to make sure that your points are heard, please click on the hand sign and I will ask our tech master Georg to open your audio and video settings. During the session, you can post messages in the chat section, but I strongly suggest that please concentrate on Anne's lecture and convey whatever you wish to share at the end. Each session is recorded, which you can access on our platform. Please give us 2 to 3 days in order to edit it and upload it onto our platform. If you have any issues, any problems with accessing the recordings, please send me an email. Now, over to you, dear Anne.
Thank you, Georgie. I'm just going to say good morning to everybody, or good evening, or good afternoon. It's lovely to be with you. And I'm very happy to share this talk with you in these webinars. But I would ask you not to take notes because it's impossible to take notes and to listen. And you'll have the text as well as the video later on. So here's the title, The Long Journey to a New Story. And it's a very, very long journey that we've made on this planet. 200,000 years ago, the first humans named Homo sapiens were in Africa. 100,000 years ago, they'd spread all over Africa. 40,000 years ago, they reached southern and eastern Europe. And from Africa, they slowly spread out to other parts of the world, to China, to India, to the Americas. Now, this is the story that's been presented and promoted by archaeologists today. I'm not sure it's fully accurate yet. I haven't fully accepted it, but this is what I was told in a webinar on television about 2 weeks ago. That was the story that I was given. In Europe, they found two other groups of people, the Neanderthals and the Denisovans, each a separate branch of hominids who had also migrated out of Africa. The three groups seem to have integrated to some extent with each other, but eventually the Neanderthals died out, with the last remnants living in Gibraltar. The Homo sapiens group didn't wipe out the Neanderthals. They gradually disappeared for reasons that are still unknown. The Denisovans moved northwards into Siberia and eastwards into Southeast Asia. The world population today, all of us, carries genetic traces of all three groups, apparently. Now, 120,000 years ago, ice sheets that were several miles deep covered the whole of the northern European plain and North America. And this lasted until about 21,000 years ago, when a thaw set in, lasting for several thousand years, when the huge ice fields at last began to retreat. The earliest known cave paintings in Europe date to 37,000 years ago. They were made by a group of hominids called Homo sapiens sapiens. No one knows exactly where they came from or why they settled in northern Spain and southwestern France. The climate became freezing cold as it entered the Ice Age, but they were able to survive by hunting animals like the aurochs and many species of deer. These animals, as well as the cave lion, the bear, and the rhinoceros, were all drawn on the walls of these caves and have been miraculously preserved until our time. If you haven't seen them, do go and see them, because it's a life-changing experience. These people didn't live in the caves, but used them as a kind of temple in which to hold their shamanic rituals. Their lives depended on the animals they drew on the cave walls. They were highly skilled artists and artisans and shamans. Now, in 1994, the enormous Chauvet cave was discovered in France, near the Rhone Valley. Discovered accidentally by three cavers who were struck dumb with wonder at the huge amount of wonderful drawings they found as they went deeper and deeper into this enormous cave. They were so overwhelmed that they couldn't even speak to each other in whispers. They were just struck dumb with wonder. It is now known that the drawings on the cave walls were made in two periods, between 37,000 to 33,500 years ago, and again in another period from 31,000 to 28,000 years ago. And a replica has been built nearby. And I've just shown you one picture of the beautiful horses there. I've got one other one to show you. I couldn't resist showing this image of a bison because it so perfectly follows the contours of the cave wall, and they were experts at doing this. And up in the corner is a snowy owl, and those two animals still exist today after 35,000 years. Extraordinary. Now, in this drawing from Lascaux, which is dated to 20,000 years ago, a shaman lies in the trance with his penis erect. His shaman's staff lies behind him. Like the bird in flight, the shaman was able to enter a deeply altered state of consciousness. He traveled to the inner dimensions to speak with the soul of the animals and ask them to return to be hunted again. The animals were regarded as sacred, and the cave was symbolically the great mother of both humans and animals, from which all life emerged. There is evidence from the paintings that the people of this early time studied the stars and the movements of the moon and the sun through the constellations. While the main focus of their brief lives was obviously on survival, the existence of cave paintings from many different areas of the world shows that they gave great importance to the rituals that were connected with these. And I'm going to show you these handprints from all parts of the world, as far south as Patagonia in South America, as well as South Africa, Indonesia, and Australia. Some were made by blowing charcoal or sandstone onto the wall through a pipe, or even mixing charcoal with saliva and spitting it around a hand placed on the wall. I've seen a man do this in France. It's extraordinary. There's something very moving about these handprints, as if people making them were touching another dimension, the other side of the wall, so to speak, as well as leaving their imprint on the walls. We now know a great deal about the Paleolithic era on different continents, from the cave paintings, as well as from the great variety of tools. But we are missing a large and vital part of our history, the legacy of a past that was virtually wiped out and has almost been forgotten. About 12,800 years ago, or 10,800 BC, after 2,000 years of accelerating global warming at the end of the Ice Age, there was a terrifying cataclysm. Evidence has been emerging slowly over the last decade and was reported in the media in London in April 2017 that approximately 12,800 years ago, the planet was hit by multiple fragments of a huge disintegrating comet. This comet caused catastrophic damage to the planet and wiped out much of human and animal life. Worldwide, there are multiple accounts of this catastrophe and also warnings given about its approach. Some tell of a star with a long, wide tail that came down and burnt everything up. I'll just show you a couple of pictures, really, of what it might have looked like coming towards us. These fiery objects, terrifying intensity of speed. And then they would have hit the planet. And that would have, the shock would have been unbelievable, and the terror unimaginable. What happened was that the enormous ice fields covering Canada, which were 2 kilometers thick, abruptly melted under the impact of up to 8 large fragments of this disintegrating comet. In 2018, a crater that was 19 miles or 31 kilometers across was found in northwest Greenland under the Hiawatha Glacier. And that may be from the impact of one of these fragments, and is thought possibly to date to this time. Other large fragments fell on the North European ice field and further to the east. And this hypothesis is supported by the Comet Research Group, composed mainly of geologists, and also by Graham Hancock, because it's the geologists who really can find out the details of what happened. They have access to more knowledge than anybody else about this. The comet is thought to have exploded over Canada, and the colossal heat generated by the impacts of these fragments, some up to 2 kilometers wide, with a combined explosive power of 10 million megatons, caused the sudden catastrophic melting of these ice fields and sent a gigantic wall of water surging down into North America, carrying enormous boulders with it. This wiped out the people of the Clovis culture of North America, as well as 35 species of animals, including mammoths and mastodons and saber-toothed tigers and lions. And this happened very suddenly before any human or animal had time to flee. There were also continent-wide fires which sent huge quantities of toxic smoke and dust and ash into the upper atmosphere, blocking out the sun. Torrents of freezing fresh water flowed into the Atlantic, disrupting the warming currents there, like the Gulf Stream, and triggering another ice age. This inconceivable cataclysm affected 50 million square kilometers as far south and east as Syria. Huge fragments of the comet also fell over the Atlantic and across Europe, melting the European ice cap. Cave dwellers in the Dordogne area of France seem somehow to have survived this catastrophe and did not record it on their cave walls, as far as we know, but I doubt whether anyone's actually looked for it. In the Journal of Geology in September 2014, a paper summarizing the evidence for a comet as the cause of what's called the Younger Dryas period says, a cosmic impact event at the onset of the Younger Dryas cooling episode is the only hypothesis capable of explaining the simultaneous deposition of peak abundances in nanodiamonds, magnetic and glassy spherules, melt glass, platinum, and or other proxies across at least 4 continents, approaching 50 million square kilometers. The evidence strongly supports a cosmic impact 12,800 years ago. This cataclysmic event triggered what is called the Younger Dryas period, a period of freezing cold, really freezing cold, which lasted 1,000 years, a little over 1,000 years, from about 10,800 BC until about 9,700 BC. There's slightly varying estimates about this. The Ice Age returned, and people and animals who had survived the catastrophe perished in the cold and from lack of food. Here is a map which shows the sudden plunge in temperature during the Younger Dryas period. If you look along the bottom line where it says 10,500 BC, you'll see the dip in the diagram going right down to the bottom there. So I didn't know anything about this 2 months ago. This has all been amazing discovery from my point of view. This map shows the impact field of the comet and the boundaries of the Younger Dryas period, extending over this huge area of 50 million square kilometers. And this is a second map of the field showing the southern hemisphere as the northern one, and the how it affected both areas. Now, there was the sudden rise in sea levels also drowned a huge section of land called Sunderland, which connected Indonesia to the mainland of Southeast Asia and possibly land connecting Indonesia with Australia, leaving only a scattering of 13,000 islands. It also separated Ceylon from India. This picture shows the area of land called Sunderland that surrounded the Indonesian islands and connected them to the mainland of the Chinese mainland until the time of the Cataclysm. You can see the darker areas are Sumatra and Java and Borneo and Malaysia in the lighter green area. So I just found this map by chance, needless to say, on Google, that great friend of people who are trying to do these things. Now, there is a manuscript in the British Museum called the Troano Manuscript, which tells of the disappearance of a very large continent in the Pacific that was swallowed up overnight by the sea after tremendous earthquakes that were so severe that they split the island into sections and caused it to sink without trace. This catastrophe was said to have happened about 12,500 years ago, and 64 million people were said to have died with it, together with all the animals. That's what it's saying in the bit underneath the map. You can see the bottom line. They sank with their 64 million inhabitants, 8,000 years before the writing of this book. This, fascinatingly, was confirmed by temple records in India that were discovered and deciphered by someone called James Churchward in a remarkable book that he published in 1959 called The Lost Continent of Mu, which described the life of the island and recorded its catastrophic demise. This was the original motherland from which daughter colonies were established in South and Central America to the east, and in India, Indonesia and Sunderland to the west. Only a few small islands in the Pacific, including Hawaii, Easter Island, and the Marshall and Polynesian Islands, are the tiny remnants of it. I would like to connect this catastrophe with very recent excavations that have been made into a hill called Gunung Padang in West Java. What was found has stunned the archaeological community and enraged a good few of them. The majority of the 100-meter hill is man-made and is not actually a hill at all. It is a terraced pyramid built up over millennia by the oldest civilization the world has yet discovered. Although few knew it, there has been an ancient pyramid hiding underneath the mountain in Indonesia for millennia. Gunung Padang means the mountain of light, and one researcher has reason to believe that this may be the oldest pyramid still standing on Earth, possibly 20,000 years old. This is a reconstruction, by the way. The hill is still covered with earth and grass and trees and everything, and they're just digging in little by little. Gunung Padang is evidence of a very advanced ancient civilization, and it changes and challenges everything archaeologists thought that they knew about the history of human civilization. I think it may have been part of the civilization that existed on the continent of Lemuria or Mu, not far to the east, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. perhaps the only remnant of what the temples there looked like. Now, a second cataclysm happened about 11,700 years ago, or 9,700 BC, at the end of the Younger Dryas period. The first cataclysm happened at the beginning, and this second one happened at the end of this Dryas period. And I brought here a picture of the Earth hit or affected by a solar outburst, because this is a theory that people are considering as the cause of the second cataclysm. It's not as clear as the first one, the causes of it. Graham Hancock thinks it may have been caused by fragments of the same comet that had returned, this time hitting the oceans rather than the land. However, another hypothesis put forward by Robert Schoch, professor of geology at Boston University, suggests it was due to an enormous solar outburst, which literally melted the glaciers overnight and led to the sudden rise in sea levels up to 100 feet at least all over the world. And this was sudden, unbelievably sudden. Whichever theory is ultimately proven to be correct, the result of both cataclysms was the same, a devastating flood caused by the second sudden collapse of the North American and Northern European ice caps, which had reformed during the Younger Dryas period. So in both cases, there was the same kind of effect, as it were. Gigantic tsunamis were carried inland for hundreds of miles. Huge walls of water, some coming over mountains, advanced on helpless communities. There were torrential rains, earthquakes, and volcanic eruptions like the one on Krakatoa, which blotted out the sun for years. Enormous fires scorched whole continents. The survivors took refuge in caves and carved out underground tunnels which could provide them with some shelter from the cold. Some of these can still be seen in Turkey, in Cappadocia, and in a place called Derinkuyu, although they're not able to date them because so many people have lived in them over the millennia. They can't be sure when they were actually built. Anyway, this tremendous cataclysm marked the final end of the Ice Age. Now, the Great Flood destroyed the city and island of Atlantis. Its sudden disappearance in a day and a night was recounted by Plato and dated by him to circa 9,600 BC, which Hancock takes as the proper date, although Schoch thinks it's 100 years earlier. Plato says that a Greek lawgiver called Solon had traveled to Egypt and heard the story of the flood from the priests of Sais in the Delta, who had records of it in their temple. In his Timaeus and Critias, Plato records the destruction of a large landmass and a renowned city that he called Atlantis. He also gives a precise description of its layout and dimensions, and also the reach of its power far into the Mediterranean. This is what he wrote. There was an island opposite the strait you call the Pillars of Hercules. On it, there was a remarkable dynasty of kings who ruled the whole island. In addition, they controlled Libya up to the borders of Egypt and Europe as far as Tyrrhenia, which is Italy. Plato added that there were earthquakes and floods of extraordinary violence, and in a single dreadful day and night, the island of Atlantis was swallowed up by the sea and vanished. Plato said that this catastrophe had happened because the people of Atlantis ceased to be able to carry their prosperity with moderation. And he goes on, to the perceptive eye, the depth of their degeneration was clear enough, but to those whose judgment of true happiness is defective, they seemed, in their pursuit of unbridled ambition and power, to be at the height of their fame and fortune. Could these words from so long ago also apply to our culture today? Plato said the destruction was so complete that people had to begin again, like children. This account by Plato has generally been dismissed as a fabrication without any basis in truth. But the repetition of a cataclysm 9,700 years ago, together with Robert Schoch's solar outburst theory, suggests that it was fact rather than fiction. In destroying Atlantis, the Great Flood destroyed a highly developed and technologically advanced civilization, which had large ships powered by some unknown method of propulsion, which traveled west to the coast of Central and South America, east to the Mediterranean, and south to Africa. So they were able to connect with the coastline of America long before we knew anybody could do. The memories of the Great Flood have been recorded in stories and myths passed down for thousands of years by people all over the world. Both catastrophes were so immense and so widespread that they have never been forgotten. I have a book called When the Earth Nearly Died, published in 1994, that gives detailed descriptions of the terror and horror of the flood from every part of the world. It could apply to either cataclysm and is still available from Amazon if anyone's interested. The Zend Avesta in Persia records a devastating flood and also the building in advance of an underground city to save both people and animals, an account similar to the story of instructions to build an ark that is mentioned in Sumerian texts as well as in Genesis. The story of the Great Flood was recorded in the Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh, whose oldest written accounts date to 2000 BC, although Gilgamesh himself is thought to have lived around 2700 BC. From the Sumerian records, it passed to the later Babylonian ones and eventually to the Book of Genesis. It was also recorded by different groups of Indians in North and South America and by people living in India and the Far East. There's a Hindu text called the Shatapatha Brahmana, which describes a devastating flood in antiquity. The myth of the fall in Genesis and our expulsion from the Garden of Eden may be a distant record of this catastrophe, and I think it's very important for a deeper understanding of the myth that's affected our Western culture for so long. Now, what is absolutely fascinating is that there are temple inscriptions and legends from Egypt and Mesopotamia, as well as from Central and South America, which tell of godlike beings who arrived from the sea in large ships after these catastrophes. They taught people the arts of civilization, how to grow crops, and how to build great temples aligned to the stars. Hieroglyphs on the walls of the temple of Edfu in Egypt, which is dedicated to the god Horus, are copies of even more ancient texts. The whole walls in Edfu are simply covered with these hieroglyphs. They speak of godlike men wearing strange headdresses who came in large ships and taught the people the basic skills of civilization. These Edfu records speak of 7 sages who were called the sons of Horus and who wore falcon headdresses. They described them as the builder gods, the sages, the lords of the light, and the shining ones. They appear to have been a chain of initiates known as the followers of Horus. They also speak of a sacred place, homeland of the primeval ones, in the midst of a great ocean where a terrible catastrophe took place, destroying it utterly and killing almost all its inhabitants. This was the first cataclysm of 10,800 BC. The hieroglyphs say that a few survived and set sail in their ships to build a new civilization in a different place. One of those places was Egypt, and another was Gobekli Tepe. Now, the Mesopotamian clay tablets also speak of 7 sages or godlike beings called the Apkallu, who came to Mesopotamia before the flood and taught the people there for several thousand years. These 2 images show men who are part man and part fish, and the leader was called Oannes, and they brought civilization to man, apparently. In Sumer, the Apkallu returned after the flood. They'd already been there before, but they returned after the flood to help the people to rebuild civilization. Sumerian records name 5 great cities that existed in Sumer before the flood, and say that the people living in one of them, called Sippar, buried their records before the flood, having had warning of it, and returned to recover them after it. These sages were masters of astronomy, architecture, metallurgy, stone cutting, and carpentry. In Egypt, Isis and Osiris may have originally been 2 of these great sages who brought with them knowledge of how to rebuild civilization. This godlike group of people seems to have built or rebuilt the foundations of civilization in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Turkey, as well as South and Central America. Graham Hancock writes that thanks to the advice and teaching of these extraordinary sages, human civilization received rapid scientific and technological advances and entered a period of exceptional splendor and plenty, the golden age before the flood. I'm going to show you some more of these images. These images of winged beings who hold something that looks like a pine cone and also a kind of handbag are not from the period of the flood, but from Assyria several thousand years later. Nevertheless, they may represent winged beings from legends that were never forgotten, but passed down from generation to generation in the records made by temple priests, both in Egypt and in Sumer and Babylonia. So just take us a few seconds to look at them. Watch where the handbag is in that figure on the left and the pine cone. Notice their wings. Notice the central one is carrying something like poppy heads, dried poppy heads, possibly for hallucinogenic use. They have a strange sort of band on their wrist, which has a solar disk in the middle of it. And they have, in the bottom row, they have animal heads or bird heads, either a falcon or an eagle, possibly a falcon, as the text in Egypt referred to them as falcon-headed beings. And notice the big, powerful legs, the right leg, which is always shown with tremendous power, strength in the leg. And some of them have daggers stuck into their robe. They're all extraordinarily beautiful, and the actual sculptural skills of the men who made them is extraordinary. Here is a magnificent relief of the Babylonian god Marduk with the same handbag and pine cone, and also a helmet with triple serpents on it. Notice the leg and the beauty of the wings. They always have 4 wings. And here are more images of these winged godlike beings, this time shown as if they are guarding or fertilizing a tree of life, which appears very often in Babylonian and Assyrian sculptures, wall sculptures. The top image has a winged sun disk above it. They all carry handbags and the strange pine cone. The top figures are Assyrian and from the palace of Ashurbanipal II, dating to about the 7th century BC, or over 8,000 years after the flood. Yet Ashurbanipal himself still refers to the flood as if it were familiar to him, as if the story was still known in his court, or maybe acted in his court. One doesn't know. All these images come from Sumer, Babylonia, and Assyria. Nevertheless, they are almost the only images we have which connect with the legends of the extraordinary beings or godlike men visiting the shores of the ravaged lands and teaching the people architecture and astronomy, as well as how to grow crops. The Inca records of Peru and the Egyptian inscriptions in the temple of Edfu both refer to them as the shining ones. I wonder whether they were not extraterrestrials, visitors from certain stars, such as Sirius and the Pleiades. And I've put a note reference to a website there which will tell you about extraterrestrials. As a last image from the Olmec culture in Mexico, dating from 1200 to 400 BC, we have this man seated in what is thought to be a flying vehicle, shaped like a feathered serpent and holding the same mysterious handbag in one hand. Can you see the handbag? The Olmec culture predated the Aztec and Mayan ones and was characterized by the huge heads that they sculpted. Now I'm going to look at some South American buildings because they're extraordinary too. No one can say, yes, I want to briefly show you, these are from Cusco. These enormous blocks of stone are built, nobody knows how old they are. They're certainly not from the Incan period. The Incan people built on top of them, but they didn't actually build them. And here again, we have another center called Sacsayhuaman, also in Peru, not far from Cusco. And these colossal blocks, nobody knows how they were transported to their present site or how they were fitted closely together so that there's hardly even a space for a razor blade to fit between them. The majority of these blocks weigh over 20 tons, some even weigh 100 or 200 to 300 tons. They are not built by the Inca, as I said, but by some civilization long preceding it, thought to be as old as 30,000 years, but in any case predating both cataclysms. And here is the Pyramid of the Sun in Teotihuacan. I find these pronunciations difficult in Mexico, about 100 AD, much later. This is millennia later than the stone buildings in Peru, but it is still an extraordinary complex of many pyramids, including the huge pyramids dedicated to the sun and the moon, with a giant causeway linking them all together. Its sheer size and grandiosity suggests that it may have been built on the ruins of older buildings. I haven't been there, but it looks an absolutely amazing place, and I know that many people have been there who may be on this course. This is Chichen Itza in Yucatan, to a likely later period, 550 AD. Now, pyramids have been found all over Central America, in Yucatan and other places. And in 2018, laser scanning, or a technology called LiDAR, was able to penetrate the dense jungle area of Guatemala from the air. And to the astonishment of those looking at what this technology revealed, and all of us watching on television, they saw hitherto unknown Mayan cities and more than 60,000 other structures with farms and roads, and above all, pyramids. It is thought that as many as 20 million people may have lived here. This astounding new technology is comparable to the astronomical discoveries made by the Hubble telescope, because it's going to reveal so much that we haven't known until this time, really. What I've shown you so far suggests that after the double catastrophes of 10,800 and 9,700 BC, extraordinary civilizations arose in South and Central America. Did they build on the ruins of earlier temples and pyramids? Did the original people who built the incredible stone structures in Cuzco and Sacsayhuaman and Tiahuanaco in Peru and Bolivia come originally from the lost continent of Mu or Lemuria in the Pacific? And are these giant structures in South America connected to the giant statues on Easter Island, one of the few islands to remain after the continent sank beneath the sea? Now I come to Egypt. Egyptian civilization is now known to be much older than previously thought. Was its extraordinary rise due to the fact that survivors of the first great catastrophe in 10,800 BC found their way to Egypt and laid the foundations of a new civilization there? Egyptian records speak of a golden age called Zep Tepi, the first time, when the gods lived among humans. Now, the date the Sphinx was constructed has been put back far beyond the dynastic period, which was circa 4 to 5,000 BC, to a period when Egypt during the 1,000-year Younger Dryas period was not a desert as it is today, but was warmer, wetter, and greener than the freezing northern regions. The Sphinx is huge, 20 meters high by 70 meters long, carved directly out of the rock. The geologist Robert Schoch realized that it had to be dated to at least 10,000 BC because the deep trenches on its limestone flanks could only have been gouged out by the torrential rain that fell during the Cataclysm at the end of the Younger Dryas period in 9,700 BC. Originally, the Sphinx had the head of a lioness, see the image below, a goddess called Mehit, whose role was to act as guardian of the archive located beneath the Sphinx's left paw. And the funny-shaped object above the lioness's body is actually the symbol of a key. And that was the key to the records, the archives that were beneath his left foot. Incredibly, this archive has so far not been excavated. It is possible that the records it holds could go back to the era when the Sphinx was carved, 10,000 BC, and to Zep Tepi, the first time. The head was recarved around 2,500 BC in the 4th dynasty, and was replaced with the head of a pharaoh that we see today. The temple next to the Sphinx with its enormous blocks of stone was also constructed at this early date, and possibly the ground plan of the three pyramids of the Giza Plateau was laid out at that time also, although they were built later. Now, the Great Pyramid and the two pyramids next to it would have looked like this when they were covered with the white limestone blocks that would have made them brilliant white both by day and by night. You can imagine their effect in the full moon. It must have been extraordinary to see them all covered with the white limestone. The Great Pyramid covers 13 square acres, and it is an octahedron with a square base and 8 triangular sides. Its 8 sides can only be seen from the air at dawn and dusk of the spring and autumn equinoxes, when the light throws them into clear relief. It is the most extraordinary engineering feat on the planet, and it was built by unsurpassed masters of astronomy and architecture. Its ground plan and octahedron shape could only have been laid down by people with a profound knowledge of astronomy. There is no way it could have been built by slaves hauling stones up ramps. No way that it could have been built in dynastic times, because the Egyptians at that time did not have the tools needed to cut, raise, and fit gigantic blocks of stone with incredible precision. Granite is one of the hardest stones to cut, and their copper and stone tools would not have been able to cut through and shape the enormous granite blocks. We do not know exactly what date the pyramid was constructed or what technology was used to cut, lift, and put in place 2.5 million granite blocks, raised 480 feet above the ground, each with an average weight of 2.5 tons, as well as fitting the incredibly beautiful limestone blocks that cover the granite blocks. It is possible that a laser saw harnessed to the power of the sun was used to cut the blocks of granite, and some method of sound technology may have possibly been used to put them in place. There's a lot about this on the internet, which you can follow if you want. The huge stone covering the king's chamber alone weighs 100 tons. How was this block lifted into position? The case is still open. The capstone is thought to have been a meteorite that was covered with gold leaf, which gleamed in the light of the sun. According to a mathematician friend of mine, the geometric features of the whole structure suggest that these master builders understood the geometry of space and the geometry of the universe. The pyramid was aligned to true north within 3/60th of 1 degree, which is absolutely incredible precision. And its dimensions incorporate both the radius and the circumference of the planet. All this is utterly astounding. When the construction engineer Robert Bauval visited the Giza Plateau, he wondered what was the basic plan that the construction of the 3 pyramids followed. He knew that in 2500 BC, the shaft from the king's chamber in the Great Pyramid was aligned on the lower star of Orion's belt, and that the southern shaft from the queen's chamber was oriented on the star Sirius. And he suddenly realized in a flash that the Nile River was the earthly reflection of the Milky Way, and that the position of the 3 pyramids, with one slightly out of alignment with the other 2, corresponded to the exact position in relation to each other of the stars of Orion's belt. In a flash of insight, he saw that in the 3 pyramids he was looking at, Orion's belt was laid out on the ground before him. He wrote a book about this. In a later book written with Graham Hancock, they place the date of the Sphinx at 10,500 BC, the time when, as Robert Schoch realized, the lioness goddess Mehit would have faced the rising sun and the constellation Leo on the eastern horizon, with the great star Sirius just above the horizon and the constellation Orion to the right at the very lowest point in its 25,920 years precessional cycle. This, they thought, would mark the first time, or Zet Tepi, referred to in the ancient Egyptian texts. And this would have been approximately 300 years after the first great cataclysm of 10,800 BC. Now, the temple of Osiris, or the Osirion at Abydos, was also built at this very early date. Its truly enormous blocks of stone were put in place by a highly advanced technology, more advanced than ours is in today, as were the gigantic stones of the temples of Peru and Bolivia. Osiris was associated with the constellation of Orion, which was tremendously important in both Egypt and Gobekli Tepe, as we shall see. Now, found on one of its pillars was this beautiful image, this beautiful double image of the flower of life, which seems to have been burnt into the stone by some unknown method. It wasn't chiseled in, it was burnt in, and it survived all this time. Now we come to Gobekli Tepe. Gobekli Tepe, and you can see it's situated just where the area where they're fighting, just over the Syrian border in Turkey. That white line is the border between them. It's situated in eastern Turkey, near the Syrian border, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. It was discovered by a farmer in 1963 who tried to raise a hullabaloo about it, but nobody paid any attention to him until excavation was begun by Klaus Schmidt, a German archaeologist, in 1995. And it was discovered that it dates to 12,000 years ago, or 10,000 BC, which is absolutely astounding. It is a momentous discovery that has, like the revised dating of the Sphinx, thoroughly upset the archaeological records. It is thought to be one of the most extraordinary and extensive archaeological sites ever uncovered, the size of 13 football fields. It is the oldest temple complex in the world, thought to have been constructed not long after the first great cataclysm of 10,800 BC and the beginning of the Younger Dryas period. It has 50 to 60 circles, with only 4 so far excavated. Inside the excavated circles are T-shaped monolithic pillars, 16 feet high, weighing between 10 and 60 tons, some of which are engraved with signs of the zodiac and animals, and also on one of the pillars, a headless man, and other images offering evidence of a comet strike and massive loss of life, as well as a warning to us at this time of the comet's future return. It seems to have been a temple or a complex of temples built specifically for the surveillance of the stars and for tracking the star Sirius in particular. The actual carving out from the rock of the many thin stone-shaped, T-shaped pillars was an extraordinary feat in itself. They're so slender, it's just amazing, without considering the quality of the relief carvings on the pillars. Whoever supervised the building of these strange temples also initiated agriculture in this region, which must have had a population when these were being built of several thousand. Whoever directed and supervised the building of these temple sites had a very high competence in astronomy, as well as architectural and sculpting skills and the knowledge of how to grow crops. When Robert Schoch imagined one of these main pillars, he realized the T-shaped pillar could represent Orion, the headless hunter of the skies, complete with his belt, loincloth, and even his dog, associated with Sirius, which later was called the dog star. All the pillars look south and east, the direction of Orion, Sirius, and the Pleiades in the constellation of Taurus. For reasons unknown, the whole huge complex was buried around 8000 BC, some 1700 years after the second cataclysm, and it remained hidden until the 1963 discovery. And why they were filled in is still an unsolved mystery. So here are some pictures of the circles and the strange T-shaped slender pillars. Some of the pillars were destroyed, I think, by the second cataclysm, and they were rebuilt before they covered everything over. And you can see in the bottom picture that the orientation of that circle was on the star Sirius. And different circles apparently were built to follow the movement of that star through the heavens over thousands of years. Here is a carving on one of the pillars. In fact, I think several of them of presumably a man wearing a belt, and you can see here the hands coming forward, like they are on the figure of the right. The figure on the right comes from Urfa, which is nearby, but is not in Gobekli Tepe itself. And that strange belt comes up in other places, even in South America. It's something kind of archetypal that recurs in these statues everywhere. And here I've put on the left is from a beautiful, beautiful sculpture from Gobekli Tepe of a bird man with a strange caduceus-like body and wings coming out of it. And on the right, I've put Horus from Egypt as the birdman of Egypt, because Horus, that the temple of Edfu was dedicated to, was an immensely important Egyptian god, the son of Isis and Osiris. I just thought it was interesting to see the comparison of birdmen in each place. Now, pillar 43 shows animal reliefs representing zodiacal signs and 3 strange handbags again at the top. These handbags are identical to those shown in the Babylonian and Assyrian reliefs and in the figure from Mexico. But these are all many thousands of years later than Gobekli Tepe. What was the thread of transmission that connected these very different cultures on different continents over this huge expanse of time and distance? No one has yet fathomed out the meaning of those handbags at the top. And you'll have to read Graham Hancock to understand the whole meaning of this particular pillar, which is very interesting. These recent discoveries have shaken the timeline usually presented by archaeologists, anthropologists, and historians, since they indicate that civilization, including astronomy, architecture, and mathematics, and the advanced technology of building enormous stone temple complexes, began much, much earlier than has been thought. In Peru and Colombia, the shamanic traditions being explored by Westerners today may have originated in the pre-flood era, as did the shamanic traditions of the great seers of India in a totally different area of the planet. I think it is clear from all that I've shown you that there were highly developed civilizations existing before the 2 great cataclysms, which utterly destroyed them, one at the beginning and the other at the end of the freezing Younger Dryas period. People living in them were not primitive or existing in survival mode, but had built great cities with extraordinary temples oriented on specific stars and constellations. They had also developed agricultural practices which fed large populations. They were extraordinary sculptors and architects. Particularly in the case of Mu or Lemuria, they had established thriving colonies to the east in South and Central America, and to the west in Indonesia, which before the rising sea levels caused by both cataclysms was part of a much larger landmass. Both Lemuria and Atlantis had large ocean-going ships and obviously would have traded extensively with other countries. Their stone carving and stone lifting technology was, in the case of the great builders of the pyramids and temples in Egypt and South America, more developed than anything we have today. So we can only guess at what it was and how they used it to create these magnificent buildings. Now, I have told you an extraordinary story, much of it still unknown and unacknowledged, unknown to me except in small details. It shows that civilization began thousands of years before the account we have been given, that it nearly died twice and was regenerated twice. The 2 cataclysms would have inflicted a grievous trauma on the human psyche. All the events I have described will have been held in what Jung called the collective unconscious of our species, in our species' memory, and in fact some of them have been recovered under the use of psychedelic drugs. People have gone into these memories and seen what happened then. For long ages, people would have focused only on survival, yet there have also been periods of extraordinary creativity, leading to the most advanced and enlightened civilizations, such as that of Egypt. The part astronomy played in the building of temples and pyramids everywhere is phenomenal and is largely overlooked by archaeologists. For me, this first talk has led on an amazing journey of discovery, and I hope it has done the same for you. I've given some details of something called Ancient Architects videos, which give fascinating information, also videos by Graham Hancock and Robert Schock and his website. Next week, I will look at the lunar era of the Great Goddess or Great Mother and the civilization of old Europe. And I will show how her image was carried forward into the high civilizations of the Bronze Age and the great goddesses of Egypt, Sumer, Babylonia, and Anatolia. So thank you very much, and I hope you've enjoyed it. Now, what do? I do something.
Stop screen
Stop
share.
share. Thank you. There we are. There I am.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. This was definitely a feast to the mind and heart. And actually, I must say that I had a huge aha moment while you were talking. I have a few little objects next to my computer just to keep me and my data protected. And as you were talking about the Assyrians, I just reached out to one of my objects I got last August from a Persian carpet shop. And Killen and I, we tried to figure out that where he's from Assyria. And this is the winged.
Oh, the winged being. It's from Assyria. Do they know what date? Did they say what date?
No idea. The owner actually got it from Mongolia. But look at the helmet, the serpent helmet. I don't know if I'm showing it right.
Yes, you are. Yes, how interesting.
It's amazing, isn't it?
It's a sort of composite of many different cultures, part Indian, part Mongolian, part...
I think so, yeah, because he doesn't have beard, but also you were talking about the right foot. Is it?
The right foot forward, yeah.
And the serpents all over. And also he's standing on a disc with probably feathers as well.
Yeah, and he's got wings. And he's got wings. It's very
wings. And beautiful, absolutely beautiful carving.
Yeah, how lovely.
It's like a Birdman.
Mm.
Anyway, this was my aha moment, happiness. I wanted to share with you. Thank you so much. This is actually the book that Anne is referring to. And I must say that when I was reading it, I was absolutely fascinated by all the data. And he clearly demonstrated that throughout archaeological findings that the survivors of those more advanced civilizations transferred skills and technology to the hunter-gatherers. So I was actually thinking that how come that we don't know about these things? We are not taught about these things at school. And why do you think, Anne, that this information is coming to our consciousness now? Is there a reason that they were hidden from us for some time and we need to really rediscover our past?
Yes, I think they're coming. I think even in my own life, I've had these books in my library since 1959, which is 60 years. I'd never looked at it until this talk. And here it is. This is one of them.
Ah, oh yeah.
So I think that we are meant. I think that I feel I've been asked to do this, really, to bring it forward. And Graham Hancock the same, because he spent his whole life trying to find the lost continent of Atlantis. And he's gone all over the place thinking it's here and there. And he's gone along the coastlines of India, of Gujarat. He's gone the coastlines of Malta, the coastline of Japan, finding these sunken ruins of buried cities. But nobody will admit, and if they do a program on him, they mock him. Or they have, the BBC, I'm ashamed to say, mocked him when they tried to do a program on this, what I've just been talking about. And he did a marvelous program on Angkor, which was brilliant, Angkor Wat in Cambodia. Mm. But the problem is that archaeologists do not want to have their view shifted because, like everybody who's got their point of view, including me, they don't want it challenged by other people. They're fixed in their particular discipline, their academic discipline, and they don't want to look outside it because it would mean too big of an upheaval and they'd have to rewrite all the things that they'd written. And it's a very natural human instinct to defend the territory that you've got. And archaeologists and academics are very well known for doing that. Yeah. But I think it takes people like Graham Hancock and Robert Schock, who is actually teaching at Boston University, but he's gone out and found these things along on the Sphinx, which have dated it to far, far earlier than the regular Egyptian archaeologists will admit. They will not admit his findings. They just deny them. So somebody has to do the work of spreading this out in the community And one hopes maybe ubiquity will do that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. With your help for sure. And also, it is such a short-sighted view blocking this information from humankind, because it actually these scientists, they're depriving us from our own history.
Children would be fascinated. They'd love their school because it would be so interesting.
Absolutely. I have one more question, really, if I may, because I really enjoyed this book so much. But at the very end, at the concluding chapter, let me actually read his words. This is what he's saying. More than 2,000 flood myths that have come down to us from the remote past are eerily consistent on many points, and on one in particular, the cataclysm was not a random accident, we are told. We brought it upon ourselves by our own behavior, our arrogance and our cruelty towards one another, our noise and strife, and the wickedness of our hearts angered the gods. We ceased to nurture spirit. We ceased to love and tend the earth, and no longer regarded the universe with reverent awe and wonder. Dazzled by our own success, we forgot how to carry our prosperity with moderation. So it was, Plato tells us, with the once generous and good citizens of Atlantis, who in former times possessed a certain greatness of mind and treated the vagaries of fortune and one another with wisdom and forbearance, but who became swollen with the overweening pride in their own achievements and fell into crass materialism, greed, and violence. Do you think that we are repeating the past? Have we learned anything?
No.
Okay. Well, thank you. That's what I think as well. Now, Jim Garrison, I can see that you put your hand up, our dear president of Ubiquity.
Well, hello, everyone. And Anne, thank you. You left me speechless with your dazzling brilliance today. I mean, you have given an overview of human history that is profound and challenging every single assumption that we have about who we are, where we came from, and why we're here. And I just want to thank you for your opening presentation. And I just wanted to make two very quick comments. One, having been to a number of the sites that you mentioned, from Teotihuacan to the Great Pyramid to Gobekli Tepe, I've seen firsthand the enormity of the monumental architecture. And I think it's worth just stating that the sophistication that they had, for example, in moving massive 100 to 150, 200 ton solid pieces of stone with technology that we today could not even begin to replicate. So it's not the case that they were using tools that we knew about that we could easily do. They were doing things, tens of thousands of years ago that with our technology today, we cannot do. I remember being in Lebanon when I was a boy with the family, and we were driving along the road, and the guide stopped the car, took us off the side of the road, and showed us a 170-ton block of stone. And he said, nobody knows how this got here. No one knows why it was carved. It's solid block. Apparently, it was just left along the road because it either wasn't needed or the project got disturbed. And I remember being in awe as I was climbing on top of it as a boy of 15, trying to fathom what it was like to move a stone of this massive size. And the second comment that I would make is just to underscore the last reading of Georgie and the remark that you just made. I think we all need to take in, everybody, that there's a moral part to this story, and that the great commentators of the past, not only Plato, but in the Toltec records and the Indian records, all indicate that there's a relationship at a level that none of us can understand between the catastrophes that befall us and the arrogance, the hubris of our collective disregard for the rules and laws of the natural order. And I have a very deep sense that humanity, once again, is coming to one of those moments where our hubris, personified by a Donald Trump, just for starters, but embedded in a scientific paradigm that won't even allow us to discuss what Anne is bringing forward, and denies the facts on the ground for the sake of a theory that is controllable, and puts, of course, us at the pinnacle of the evolutionary progression, when that's manifestly not true. And when we think of climate change, when we think of the scientists telling us that we have till 2030 to figure this out, when we look at the arrogance of the collective political, economic, and scientific paradigm, and the imminence of the catastrophe that we ourselves are engendering, we are replicating in our day the tragedy of Atlantis. And so, Anne, I just want to thank you for bringing this to our attention, and Georgie for your smooth and your elegant moderation as usual. And so, Anne, I just want to thank you. It's a brilliant treatment and warning of the current state of human affairs.
Thank you so much, Jim, because you've given me the opportunity of doing this work, which is so exciting and wonderful at my age. It's really such a privilege to be able to do this and to have been asked to do this. And I'm very, very grateful to you. And I will come at what we've just been talking about. I'll come to in the fourth webinar and look into more in detail, the hubris and the arrogance.
Raffaello.
Hello, everybody.
Hi, Raffaello.
Hello. Thank you, Anne, for this amazing transmission. I actually just finished reading your book, The Dream of the Cosmos, today. So everything is kind of connecting and falling into a bigger picture. And my question was linked to what Georgie was somewhat sharing as well. Like, why is it that of these two cataclysms, let's say the Lemurian cataclysm and the Atlantean cataclysm, to name them in a way, the second one is thought to have come upon humanity because of human action as well, not just naturally. And that difference strikes me because no one said that about the Lemurian cataclysm, the one that sort of like started the ice age that we're talking about. So I wonder whether that pattern could, there is something that we can learn from that pattern. Was the first one a warning, and then, the second one a repetition, or why is that difference there?
Well, I think for one thing, there wouldn't have been records of the first one like there were for the second, except in the Temple of Edfu, and nobody deciphered them until very recently. So whereas the second one had records in the Sumerian texts and the Babylonian and the biblical ones, the earlier one only had, I think, the records in that text that are the Troiano manuscript in the British Museum, which didn't put any specific blame on the inhabitants. It just said it came upon them suddenly. So I think we have to be very careful, because blame comes in with the second one. It comes in with the Sumerian text, in which the gods were cross because the humans were making too much noise. So they said, let's get rid of the humans with a flood. So you get the feeling there that the gods took their vengeance on the humans, not because they were bad, just because they were making too much noise. Whereas the biblical one is definitely that God was fed up with the general degeneration of the human race and sent the flood as a punishment. So we have to be very careful in assessing this. I don't want to make any definite statement about it because I really don't know. But Plato, being a philosopher and thinking back on what had happened and everything, and knowing that there was something that was wrong with the Atlanteans, they got hubris, they got too inflated with their own importance and their own power. And when that happens, it brings its response from the universe. Because we're all connected to the cosmos, what happens on the planet and what happens within our cultures has an effect on the cosmos, and the cosmos will give a response, possibly in the form of these terrible catastrophes. I may say that I was warned in channeled messages or my mother was, in 1945, that there would be a catastrophe if we didn't change course. And I think it's perfectly possible that something that can happen again, like happened in the past, because we've simply were way, way, way off course from relationship with the cosmos. We're going our own way, thinking that we know what we're doing and we're the greatest, etc., etc. But we're in very great danger of hubris again, and of bringing the nemesis which comes with hubris. Okay.
Thank you, Raffaello.
Thank you.
Thank you. Paolo, can we hear from you? Another wonderful doctoral student of Ubiquity.
Great. So what a fascinating and terrifying journey you've taken us through, and really amazing. Terrifying because I can definitely resonate with the similarity in the moment of time we live in at the moment, in terms of status of society, and at the same time also of the climate change that we are in at the moment. So thinking about something similar that could happen is really terrifying. And so also makes me want to share this recording tonight, if ever possible, with my kids, because of course I was not allowed to access all this that you described so succinctly today. And a couple of thoughts that crossed my mind while you were speaking, Anne, and I'll just share this with you. It reminded me, particularly when you describe Atlantis, about, I don't know, maybe it's just my intuition and maybe it's the far link, but it reminded me of the Shambhala warriors. So this idea of a population which, after a crisis, came in to help and save the world, particularly the image that you share with us of God-like being coming from the sea with ships to reconstruct civilizations. And so this was quite touching for me and reminded me of books I've read in the past. Another link that I made, and again, maybe this could not apply, but it was some books I read many, many years ago about Chichen, the idea of basically that we came from extraterrestrials being, and there was this wonderful book of Zachary Sitchin that I read probably more than 15, 20 years ago. And another connection that I made, and I don't know whether it's relevant, I'm just sharing with you, is that you mentioned the records behind and below the Sphinx in Egypt as a gateway to a place where there are ancient records. And the link that I made there was with the Akashic records. So wonder whether any of these things I'm sharing with you can find some link in what you shared with us today. I'm definitely looking forward to reading the books that will be provided as a links in this course.
Yes, what you say is very interesting, because I've heard the same thing as you, that actually that we have come from other star systems to this planet for a particular purpose, which is to raise the whole planet to the level where it can take place, its place in the cosmos as a completely a planet that has completed its evolution. We're still at the rather beginning stages, I'm afraid. We've got a long way to go. But that was the idea, that we came here from other planetary systems to bring this planet up to its proper state of evolution. And also, you mentioned, what was the other thing you mentioned? Oh dear.
Shambhala warriors?
Shambhala, did you say?
Yes.
Yes. That there always have been sages directing the planet. That's been known in different cultures. They're invisible, they don't make themselves known except in certain exceptional times, which perhaps these flood times were those times. But there was something else you said which reminded me of something. Not the extraterrestrials.
Akashic records, or?
Akashic records, that's it, yes. But these records are actually, they will be hieroglyphs. If only somebody, the trouble is the Egyptian authorities will not accept what Robert Schoch has said about the lioness being the original Sphinx, and the key above the lioness's head is actually pointing to the. If you read Robert Schoch's website, you'll see what I'm talking about. It's robertschoch.com, I think it is. He goes into this and he says that they won't admit that there is such a place beneath the left paw of the Sphinx. So they aren't prepared to do the excavations to find this hall of records. But the Akasha records would be not literal ones in hieroglyphs. They would be on another plane, another dimension.
Yeah.
But they would be the ground, if you like, of our own conscious civilization that we have. They would be the invisible ground, if you like, in which everything is stored that has ever existed, not only on this planet, but in the whole universe. So certainly that's an interesting comment and very helpful. We have to put all these bits together. It's like a gigantic puzzle that the pieces have been thrown up in the air, and we've got to find them and put them all together and recreate this puzzle that will tell us who we are and why we're here. Although it's becoming clearer, I think, what we're supposed to be doing here.
Thank you, Paolo. Does this answer your questions?
Yes, thanks a lot. I'm really fascinated.
Thank you, Paolo. Momentarily, I saw Nedra Fetterman's hand up. Would Nedra still like to comment?
Well, I've been sitting here and, listening about the cataclysms and, I think somebody said it was both fascinating and terrifying, which was my experience as well. And I think the hope for me, and I think Anne addressed this, which is why I lowered my hand, was when she talked about, and these are my words, not hers, that the level of consciousness on our planet is going to affect the cosmos's response to us. And so for me, the hope is in shifting consciousness as quickly as we can. Mm-hmm. And it seems like, the shadow has become so huge and so apparent that perhaps it's a wake-up call for those of us who have just been living our lives and not paying attention. And what's happened in the United States and around the world has really gotten our attention. And I'm hoping it wakes people up quickly. And that consciousness does shift, because I think that's the only hope. And I don't think it's helpful to live terrified. And a lot of people in my community just get numb and paralyzed when they get overly anxious and terrified. So I think we need to keep holding out some kind of vision and hope of how we can grow and mature as a species quickly in the face of crisis. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if that makes any sense, but
absolutely. Absolutely, 100% sense to me. I so agree with you, Nedra, and sometimes one can get really sad and disillusioned about that where the human race is going and why we haven't really learned from our history. And this is the history that Anne revealed today as well. It is so rich and deep, and we should just embrace it and go with it and learn from our past. We do believe, as Margaret Mead said, that a small group of people can really make a big change. So we can't really expect our governments and and institutions to voice our feelings and thoughts. So we just need to make sure that we stick together and create that very coherent and cohesive group that will definitely make that necessary shift. Otherwise, we may have another big cataclysm, and whether it will be through another comet or by our own making, but we are definitely heading towards such state where we will have only two solutions, either break down or break through. And but by getting to that turning point, that will be very painful to some of us, which you would like to avoid if we can. But for that, that's what you said so rightly, Nedra, that we need to change our consciousness, and consciously we can do so. So I can see that Anne is not back with us. Jim, did you want to make a final remark?
Yeah, could I just make a comment,
Sure.
Georgie, and address what Nedra's saying? Because I think you're making a very important point, Nedra, that we're fascinated, we're terrified, we don't like to be terrified, and so what to do? And one of the things that is motivating Ubiquity University is to bring these issues into the public domain. And this is what we're doing with Anne Baring, and we'll be uploading these courses onto our YouTube channel. This is what we're doing, everyone, in Chartres this July. And we'll be sending out a communication saying that this course in July may be the most important course you'll ever take. Why? Because the issue that Anne is addressing today, the issue that we're going to be addressing in Chartres in the study of the seventh liberal art, Astronomica, is the issue of how do we understand the current world situation, which at one level is getting better and better and worse, faster and faster, in a way that leads to deeper discernment, but also leads to empowerment through the formation of community. And so I just want to underscore the importance and the magnitude of the discussion that we've been having today with Anne. And I see that Anne's come back. So Anne, you'll get a final word here in a moment. But also, just so everybody knows, Ubiquity is really trying to galvanize this discussion in a very deep and abiding way. One of the things that's implicit in what Anne is saying is the question, are we from somewhere else? What is the influence of the different planetary and star systems on human history and human behavior? And that's what we're going to be taking up in Chartres with Rick Tarnas, one of the great astrologers of our time. Anne will be there, Georgie will be there, all of us will be there. So if this conversation is important to you, Ubiquity is a place where this conversation is being fostered, both online through this webinar, in Chartres in person between July 7th and 13th of this year. So go on our website, see what else is being formulated, but by all means, be present for these next 3 sessions with Anne Baring, because by the end of this course, we'll be immeasurably more knowledgeable and therefore more wise.
Thank you, Jim. Now, Anne, is there anything you would like to share before I close this first session?
Unfortunately, I missed Nedra because we had a power cut. Just Mercury again. And I just managed to find out what I had to do to get back online, because there was no internet connection for about 5 minutes or so. But we have a generator. So the generator came on, the lights came on, and I was able to reconnect.
Well, nice to have you back. And thank you very much again for this wonderful lecture, and we look forward to seeing you all next week, same time, same place, where same time for the Americans, an hour earlier for the Europeans or elsewhere, because in the States they changed the clock this Sunday. So thank you very much for your attendance, and see you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.